Cuphead speedruns are pretty hard. That might not come as much of a shocker to anyone, but it's true. Cuphead's bosses often require a degree of precision to dodge everything they have to throw at you, but the real challenge comes from the RNG. There's quite a lot of randomness in literally every boss fight, and obviously throughout the course of the run, this can affect your time by a significant amount. However, the most meaningful impact of the RNG on Cuphead speedrunning has more to do with the playstyle it ends up demanding from the player. If a game has absolutely no RNG, you can generally memorize one set of inputs to get through the game along with maybe some backups, and for the most part it boils down to being able to execute the main game plan as well as possible. But in a high RNG game like Cuphead, because everything is so random, you cannot go through a run and expect bosses to all do the same thing every time. It's going to force you to learn how to handle multiple potential variations, and sometimes even improvise in the middle of the run. And the complexity that this creates is a big part of what makes Cuphead a difficult game to run. There is quite a lot that could be talked about at length about pretty much every boss, but today I'd like to focus on what's by far the hardest, most complicated, most important, and most infamous boss in all of Cuphead's main speedrunning category, which is 80% 1.1+. I am, of course, talking about the Devil. This fight might seem a little unassuming at first. Most people who have played this game might remember struggling more with other bosses, like Great Matchstick or Dr. Cowl's Robot, but there's quite a lot more that meets the eye in this fight. So in this video, we're going to break down this fight, explain how it works, what techniques runners attempt to beat this fight in record times, and just what makes this fight as difficult as it is. First of all, let's quickly go over the fight at the surface level. In phase 1, the Devil is sitting on his throne and will unleash attacks from there. He's only vulnerable on his head, and there's a pretty wide variety of patterns he can choose from. He can clap across the screen and force the player to jump. He can summon a pinwheel of flames. He can summon a ring of flames. He can summon 4 bouncy bubbles. He can turn into a dragon and sweep across the screen. Finally, he can turn into a spider and jump in and out of the screen. Once enough damage has been dealt, the Devil will shed his skin and jump into the underground. Flames close into the screen, forcing the player to follow and begin in phase 2. Here the player will only be able to stand on 5 floating platforms, and the Devil will only be vulnerable on his eyes. Shapes will periodically fall from the sky and force the player to dodge them. The Devil himself will also attack every once in a while, either by merging his eyes and spawning a spinning axe, or by turning to the side and spawning a bomb that, if not parried in time, will explode and cause damage through a large area. In phase 3, the arena will get smaller, removing the 2 platforms at the sides. The Devil will then spawn minions on each side that periodically shoot skulls towards the center. The Devil's eyes will begin going left and right, occasionally closing them while he spawns bats which will eventually swoop down to try and hit the player. Finally, in the 4th and final phase, the arena will further restrict to one single platform in the center. The Devil will simply begin crying while the player fires the last few finishing shots to finish the fight. However, they will have to watch out for the chip falling from the sky, which will force a pretty tight dodge between that and the Devil's tears on the sides. If the player survives this short phase, then that's gonna be the end of the fight, which will also mark the end of an 80% run. So of course now, the question is, how do people speedrun this fight? Well, buckle up, because there's genuinely a lot to unpack. Let's of course start from phase 1. At a basic level, the objective for this phase is to spend as little time as possible inside it, because the damage we can deal in this part of the fight is lower than what we can deal later on. To understand why, we have to talk a little bit about the weapons that we actually use in this run. The standard meta is to use Spread and Lobber. Spread is the weapon that deals the highest damage per second in the game, shooting 5 bullets every 9 frames, but it has the drawback of having a fairly short range. Lobber complements Spread very well, offering a higher range and the ability to set up damage traps for any boss that may spawn or walk into it, thanks to its ability to bounce on the ground and linger on screen for a long time. Its damage per second, which I will now shorten to DPS for the rest of this video because that's a mouthful, is about 20% lower than that of Spread. However, it will class it in situations where not all 5 of its bullets can be hit. And if we look at the Devil's phase 1, that is exactly the issue that we run into here. Since his hitbox is only on his head, we have to repeatedly jump to be able to deal decent damage, but we still can't constantly hit all 5 of our bullets during the time we land and take off from our jumps. There's 2 possible approaches for this. Either we simply accept the missed bullets, or we repeatedly swap to Lobber when lower to the floor and let out 1 Lobber bullet per jump, which is a more difficult approach that increases damage a little bit. Even with this, however, we are still looking at a situation where our total DPS is lower than it is later in the fight, where it's possible to hit full spread damage most of the time, so we want to spend less time in phase 1 and more time in the later phases. And since the Devil will generally finish his attacks before actually getting to a new phase, our hope is to get a combination of attacks that is just barely long enough to allow us to get to phase 2, so that we minimize the time spent in phase 1. Generally speaking, we also ideally don't want to get the dreaded spider attack. This move has quite a bit of an infamy among speedrunners, and for pretty good reasons. As a reminder, when the devil performs this move, its head turns into the spider and it will hop in and out of the screen. We can hit the spider to deal damage to the devil, but due to the way it appears on screen, it forces us to prepare lobber traps in the locations we think it'll land. The problem is, the locations it chooses are sort of random, and so is the amount of hops it'll do before returning to the devil's body, which is a number between 3 and 5. This makes it a really difficult attack to play around, and usually results in a ton of missed damage. So how does the devil choose his attacks? Are they completely random? Not entirely. The way attacks are selected is through a method that is very common throughout this game, and it's through this list. The devil will actually just follow this list of attacks in linear order, and what's random is the starting point within this list. In other words, when we start the fight, whichever of the 7 attacks we get is entirely random, but from there, the next attack that will be chosen is just the next one in the list, making options actually fairly limited. We also have to spend a moment talking about what these attacks actually mean. Clap is fairly self-explanatory, being just the devil's clap attack. Pitchfork refers to any of his attacks involving his trident, those being the pinwheel, the ring of flames, and the bouncing bubbles. Which one of these 3 attacks we get is pretty much chosen at random, with the odds of bubbles being slightly higher at a 4 in 10 odds compared to the other 2 attacks having 3 in 10 odds, at least on regular mode. The bubbles attack is also a little longer than the other 2, and it even has a bit of variance where there's 11 possible positions and angles they'll bounce off to, with 7 of these being classified as standard speed, 3 being 1.5 seconds slower and being classified as slower speed, and 1 being an additional 1.5 seconds slower and being classified as slowest speed. Finally, the head attack is a random choice between the spider and the dragon. This is a pure coin flip, with the odds of each being 50%, and as we established earlier, it is much preferable to get the dragon here, since it's a much more predictable attack that can also be hit with constant spread damage. Most phase 1s last long enough to trigger one of these head attacks, so this 50-50 is one that most attempts at the devil have to contend with, making this a fairly crucial moment in most runs that make it to this boss. And it really is very important for this coin flip to be favorable, because there's another reason why the dragon attack allows us to deal much more damage than the spider. To understand the reason, we have to talk about a very important property I haven't mentioned yet about the lubber, and it has to do with its CX move. This is a special move that we can perform by consuming a card in our super meter, which is a sort of mana meter that we can increase by hitting enemies or by parrying a pink object. The lubber's EX move is an explosive projectile that bursts once it hits any piece of collision and deals high damage to anything outside of its explosion radius. To give some numbers, this EX move deals 28 HP of damage, so compared to the spread's 41.3 HP of DPS, the ZX on its own can save close to 0.7 seconds per usage, even in situations where we can hit full spread damage. What's really notable about it is that in Cuphead versions 1.1 and below, when this EX hits any floor, it mistakenly explodes twice, effectively creating 2 explosions upon bursting and dealing double damage to anything within its range, saving double the time. This bug is a very big reason for why this category is run on version 1.1 and not any of the newer versions of Cuphead. But that's not all. When aimed in between an enemy and a floor, then there's a 50% chance it could generate 3 explosions, 1 off the enemy and 2 off the floor, dealing triple damage. The other 50% of the time, it will generate 2 explosions off the floor, and unfortunately, which result we end up getting is entirely random and dependent on Unity, the game engine that Cuphead was made with. If you want to hear more details on this topic and why all of this happens, I've actually made a video all about the lubber and its intricacies that you can go watch. But all of this is to say, the lubber EX can be a very powerful move when aimed towards the floor rather than directly towards an enemy, and if we have opportunities to do so, we want to do that. This is actually even further enhanced in the Devil's fight, and I'm afraid to have to add another layer to an already pretty complicated set of mechanics, but let's enable a hitbox viewer. At first glance, it might not look like there's anything out of place here, but if we take a closer look at the floor, we might notice that some parts of it are just a little thicker than the rest. And that is because the ground in this part of the fight is actually made up of 3 separate floor collisions in order to make it easier to create a hole in the ground when the fight transitions to phase 2. What this means is that there's 2 spots in this room where a lubber EX will hit 2 floors at the same time, and since the game will happily process both of them, we will effectively have our giant purple ball explode twice, giving us an insane quadruple damage. So, back to our head attack. During most of phase 1, the devil's hitbox is too high up and cannot be hit by the explosion of a lubber EX aimed towards the floor. However, when he does the dragon attack, then he will end up very low to the ground, and we can deal a lot of damage with our lubber EXs, making it a very favorable attack. This is possible with the spider too, however, since this attack is a lot more unpredictable thanks to the random landing locations and because he doesn't stay to the ground for very long at all, it's a lot harder to hit these lubber EXs on the spider, making it less likely to get a ton of damage off compared to the dragon, which is a much more predictable attack that provides ample opportunities to get them off. The dragon additionally makes it a bit easier to hit the EX in between its hitbox and the floor, which remember has a 50% chance of giving us extra damage. We're hitting our moves on the floor that already gives us quadruple damage, and with the extra explosion generated off of the boss's hitbox, we can get an even more insane quintuple damage. I swear I'm not making this stuff up. So yeah, the dragon is a more desirable attack. However, we also have to note that not all dragons are equal in quality. Remember that in order to deal these insane amounts of damage with the Lobbery Axe, we have to expend a card in our super meter, and to build that meter, we need to hit the devil over and over. What this means is that if we get an immediate dragon attack at the start of the fight, we will not have enough time to build our super meter much, and we will only be able to get a single EX move off. The ideal scenario is actually one where we get a few initial attacks, meaning claps and pitchforks, to give us time to build our super meter, then get a dragon attack and unleash our Lobbery Axes. This results in us spending a little longer in phase 1, but the extra damage we can get from these EX moves is well worth it. For reasons that I will explain later, we actually don't want to get too late of a dragon, or we will run into other issues, but suffices to say, the main things that we want to see in phase 1 is to get dragon instead of spider out of the coin flip on the head attacks, and ideally we want this dragon to come after 1 or 2 attacks so that we can unleash a bunch of EX moves. Alright, that was quite a lot to explain, but we're ready to move on to the rest of the fight now, which is thankfully much easier to follow. When we fall into the hole, we can actually sneak in a little bit of damage to the devil during the phase transition. That is because his hitbox for phase 2 is stored out of bounds below the phase 1 arena, and so when we're falling down, we will briefly intersect it and we can hit it with our weapons briefly. We can only damage him when we're right on top of his hitbox, because most projectiles we shoot will despawn after 1 frame of being out of bounds, so while we can shoot multiple lobbers down from a distance, we can still hit a little bit of spread and even a quick lobber bullet after we falling a little bit and are overlapped right on top of his hitbox. After that, right before the official start of phase 2, we got another trick which involves quickly pausing and unpausing the game. This is called a Geo Buffer. It's called like this because it was found by GeoDGM, and what it achieves is skipping the long animation that has Cuphead startled by the devil when falling into the underground section, and allowing us to start shooting earlier and even start moving into a better position by using an EX move. We use a Lobbery Axe, which is perfectly positioned to hit for either double or triple damage, and then move towards the center. Once again, we can damage the devil by hitting his eyes. If we're lucky enough, he will spawn a bomb instead of an axe, which allows us to parry it and get an extra card on our super meter for free. By default, these platforms here are too low, and aiming a Lobbery Axe onto them will miss the devil entirely. However, they occasionally will move farther up into the screen, and when they do, we can in fact deal double or triple damage, which we can attempt if the opportunity presents itself. However, this is not too important, because as soon as we get into phase 3, a more reliable method to get extra damage from the Lobbery Axe will become available. Remember that here the devil's eyes will travel back and forth, moving their hitboxes with them. What this allows us to do is hit a Lobbery Axe on one of these eyes just as it's starting to move away, which then results in the second eye moving into the lingering hitbox from the explosion that was just generated. And since these hitboxes are considered separate, we will get this explosion to hit the devil twice, once for each eyeball. We usually end up saving up a few cards for this phase and make fairly quick work of it with a few EX moves on the eyes. However, there's a lucky chance for something even better here. Occasionally, the devil will close his eyes to spawn bats. It's random when exactly he'll do it, but when he does, this brings the 2 hitboxes on his eyes a little closer together. If on top of that, we also get the middle platform to go up during this moment, we can aim a semi-precise EX on the floor that is able to hit both eyes with the 2 explosions it generates, netting us quadruple damage. It is also possible to do a similar thing at the very end of a phase. If we happen to know that this Lobbery Axe will bring the devil into his final phase, then we can hit it on a slightly different spot on the platform farther to the right when the left eye is at its closest to us. This will hit double damage on the left eye, and then immediately hit double damage on the right eye when it teleports farther left for the start of his stunned animation that signals the start of his final phase. Another random thing that can sometimes save some time is the minions on the side of this phase spitting a pink skull instead of a normal one, giving us an extra card, which by now should be very clear is equivalent to quite a lot of added damage. And finally, during the final phase, the hitboxes on his eyes get close enough for us to simply aim a Lobbery Axe on their sides closer to the center and hit both of the eyes, dealing double damage. With all that we've learned so far then, let's recap what an ideal fight looks like. We start off by getting some random attack in phase 1. The pinwheel flames here are at pretty good length for example, and allow us to collect 3 cards. We then get the dragon attack and unleash 3 quadruple or quintuple damage Lobbery Axes, which immediately sends the devil into phase 2. We perform the Geo Buffer to break out of the fall earlier and start shooting the devil with spread. We hopefully get a quick parry bomb and start phase 3 soon after, where we unload our Lobbery Axes onto the devil's eyes and get double damage off of each one. We also get him to close his eyes and get a high middle platform, which we quickly move over to and utilize to hit a quadruple damage Lobbery Axe. Finally, we get one last parryable skull off of a minion and use that to unleash one final Lobbery Axe into the final phase. This was a 45-second fight on the in-game timer, and admittedly, it is a bit of a pipe dream in terms of how many things worked out in our favor. A more average dragon time is around a 50, and if we get some really bad RNG with the spider in phase 1, we could be looking at 1 minute or higher, even if played fairly well. This kind of time variance is extremely high even for Cuphead standards, as the top speedrunners are often pouring dozens or hundreds of hours into trying to beat each of their personal bests by just a few seconds, and so hopefully this helps illustrate why the devil has the reputation it has. Alright, that about covers it. Thanks for watching the first half of this video, and don't forget to... Wait, first half of this video? Oh, that's right, we haven't even talked about the devil freeze. Alright, so here's the deal. As complicated as this fight already is, what I've explained so far is the basic version. There is a pretty powerful trick that can be set up in phase 1 known as the Devil Freeze, and this is what really elevates this fight to being by far the most complex boss in the entire 80% run. So what is it? To understand this, we have to talk a little bit about overdamage. With a few exceptions, most Cuphead bosses have one single health bar. We can shoot them to bring down their health, and when it reaches 0, the boss is KO'd. After damaging a boss enough, we will cross a phase threshold, and that will signal the boss to start a new phase. When that occurs, most bosses in this game will first finish whatever attack animation they're in the middle of before actually initiating the sequence that gets them to that next phase. So what happens to all the damage we deal during the time when we've dealt the damage we need for the new phase but are waiting for the boss attack to finish? A minority of bosses, like Gribby and Croaks, will immediately gain invincibility and won't allow us to damage any further until the boss has officially ended their attack and entered the new phase. Most bosses, however, will just allow us to continue dealing damage to them, and that's the case for the devil as well. So, an interesting question that now presents itself is, what happens if we cross another phase threshold before the boss has even had time to enter a new phase? This depends from boss to boss. Some bosses are programmed to be able to handle this, and might just skip a phase or instantly end it as soon as it was supposed to begin. Some other bosses, however, will react in weirder ways. For example, when this is done on Beppy the Clown's phase 1, this will result in the famous Beppy glitch, which will get him stuck in phase 2 and allow us to just pelt him down until his health drops to 0, skipping a ton of lengthy phase transitions where we can't damage him. So what happens on the devil? When we clear the phase 3 threshold during phase 1, this actually results in a soft lock. The devil will jump into the hole to get into the underground section, but when we try to follow him, nothing will happen. The fight will never progress, forcing us to retry. However, remember that at the start of phase 2, there's a trick that allows us to start moving early and damage the devil during the final descent into the underground arena, which is the Geo Buffer. Watch what happens if we do this trick and then clear the phase 3 threshold with the X move we use after unpausing the game. This completely breaks the rest of the fight, making the devil completely stop attacking. This time we can actually hit the devil, so we can finish the fight from here, though the music is completely gone, creating an oddly eerie atmosphere. However, what makes this scenario really interesting is that the platforms also get frozen in the position where the phase 3 threshold was cleared, and this allows us to aim our lobby reacts on the ground and hit the devil's eyes with the 2 explosions it generates. And I really do mean eyes plural, because since we're higher up, our lobby reacts' circular hitboxes are going to be able to extend towards both eyes at their wider span, with the full length of its diameter, which results in consistent quadruple damage EXs. But not only can we constantly hit quads, but we can potentially even hit sextuple damage with them, by hitting the 50% chance of getting 3 explosions off of a single eye, and then having the other eye move into them and getting hit 3 more times. By getting the Devil Freeze and unloading our Lobby Axes, we can deal an insanely high amount of damage in a short amount of time, and very quickly finish the fight. So, this trick is very significant, but you may also realize that trying to achieve it is fairly dangerous. We need to get the devil's health dangerously close to soft locking in phase 1, then stop dealing damage, do the Geo Buffer at the start of phase 2, then get the overdamage we need with the Lob Reacts we used during the end of our fall. The devil has 1900 total HP, and to consistently get the freeze, we need to get his health within a range of 56 HP, which is the damage that our double damage Lob Reacts will deal. Technically, we have a 50% chance of hitting a triple damage EX here, so the earlier 28 HP range will unreliably work half the times too. But if we overdamage by even a single HP, we will immediately softlock the fight. This seems to create a considerable problem. There's a lot that happens during phase 1, and it's hard to deal consistent damage and have an accurate guess of how much damage we've dealt by the end of it. But luckily, this isn't a real issue, because the answer to this conundrum lies in the bottom left of the screen. Remember that the super meter will gradually build as we do damage to the devil. What this means is that we can actually look at it to have a fairly accurate representation of how much damage we have dealt to the devil. The slightly bad news is that whenever we actually use an EX move, we need to take it into account, which will slightly complicate things, as we'll see shortly. There is another problem about the Devil Freeze, and this one is completely outside of our control. To achieve it, we need to deal a very high amount of damage in a short amount of time, because remember, we need to have the devil start one of his attacks, then not only clear the phase 2 damage threshold, but also get very close to clearing the phase 3 threshold, all within the duration of the same attack, because the devil will immediately jump into the underground section at the end of that attack to start phase 2. And to do this, we really need the help of the quadruple damage lob reaxes, which we can only hit on the dragon and spider attacks. The clap attacks simply aren't long enough, and as far as the pitchfork attacks are concerned, and I haven't mentioned this yet, it's actually the one attack that the devil will end early if enough damage has been dealt to go into phase 2. And since the spider is a big mess, though we'll come back to it later, the RNG we're looking for is similar to what we were looking for without accounting for the freeze. We want a series of attacks that allows us to build enough of a super meter to have a few EX moves ready for use, then get the 50% odds of the dragon attack, and unleash exactly however many EX moves we need to get the devil close to the phase 3 threshold. However, we need to be very careful to not actually clear this phase threshold until we do the geo buffer, so if we've dealt enough damage, we need to stop shooting to avoid soft locking, and we can use the super meter in the bottom left to understand when we should do that. This is why we don't want to actually get a dragon attack too late in phase 1. If we do, that will mean that we might have to stop shooting for a while and just waste time doing nothing. Okay, that is a lot of theory, so let's look at a few examples. As a matter of fact, let's take a look at the best devil pattern, Bubbles Dragon. Bubbles is the perfect attack to have before the dragon attack, as it's simply just long enough to allow us to get the freeze, but just barely, so we maximize the amount of time spent into the underground phase where we can hit constant spread damage. The way we play this pattern is, we shoot the devil during the Bubbles attack, collecting a parry along the way as well. Then, the dragon attack is unleashed, and here we unload 4 quadruple damage lob reaxes. Then we look at the super meter. We need to make sure we're not collecting any more than around 1.8 cards on our super meter, as doing that will soft lock, though due to the brief duration of this pattern, getting over this limit is difficult. Remember once again that our super meter correlates to how much damage we've dealt, so if we always use 4 lob reax moves and they all deal quadruple damage, this limit of 1.8 cards will always be consistent, unless we also hit a few imps, which is usually fairly negligible anyway. We do however have to get somewhat close to this limit, because once again, the damage window to get the freeze is relatively small. Anywhere between this range works pretty well. Once we get into phase 2, we do the geo buffer, hit our lob reax, then finish the fight off by attempting 2 sextuple damage lob reaxes. Now, on different phase 1 patterns, we will want to use a different amount of lob reaxes, and that will change the card amount we will want to use as our limit. Take for example the next fastest pattern, which is clap into any of the flames patterns into dragon, or the opposite, any flames patterns into clap into dragon. The series of attacks is a little longer than Bubbles Dragon, so if we were to use 4 lob reaxes on the dragon, we would have to stop ourselves from shooting the devil for quite a lot longer than with Bubbles Dragon to avoid crossing the 1.8 cards limit and soft locking. Instead, what we can do is use only 3 lob reaxes on the dragon. This allows us to keep up constant damage on the devil and still deal enough damage to reach the freeze window. The advantage of this play is that now we have one more EX move available for the freeze, which we can use for quadruple damage at the very start of that phase and speed that up by a lot. This, however, makes it so that we have to use a different card count as our limit for the super meter, because not only do we naturally keep an extra card now, but we're also lacking a quadruple damage lob reax worth of damage and have to make up for it with our regular bullets, which will increase our super meter a bit. So if we're using 3 lob reaxes, our new limit will be around 3.4 cards instead of 1.8 cards. If we're a bit off on damage and need a little bit more by the end of phase 1, we can use the off-screen hitbox deep below the hole to get that. We mentioned this much earlier in the video, but this is the devil's head being stored here, and we'll cross over it briefly, allowing us to hit it with a little bit of spread and even one lobber bullet. As a matter of fact, if we're very off on damage and need a lot more, we can even use a spread EX when crossing over this hitbox. This means we won't have it available for our quadruple damage lob reax after freezing the devil, but if it can save us from getting the freeze in the first place in a situation where we otherwise wouldn't get it by not having dealt enough damage, it is worth it. After we get the freeze, we use however many lob reaxes we have available and we quickly finish the fight. There are a lot of different patterns here, and we have to play them all differently and use a different card count depending on how many lob reaxes we've used. Here's a breakdown of each possible dragon pattern, along with their odds and best achieved times as of the making of this video. As you can see, most of the freeze patterns end up being several seconds faster than the freezeless patterns, which is a very significant difference. Some of the longer freeze patterns end up being very slow due to staying in phase 1 for a long time and sometimes even needing to stop shooting for a bit to beat up the dragon, but the fastest freeze patterns allow for some amazing times. Unfortunately, Bubbles Dragon is a pretty rare pattern, and there's some variants that are a little bit slower due to the bubbles lingering on screen for different amounts of time and falling into these 3 different categories, but all of the Clap Flames Dragon combinations aren't much slower and are a bit more likely when combined. All in all, we're unfortunately still talking about pretty low odds of getting a great time, which makes this fight a very important point in the run. All top runners are very familiar with the concept of pouring dozens of hours into finally getting a run on good pace past Cuphead's endless barrage of difficult bosses, maybe even getting on world record pace, and then just getting denied by a crappy devil pattern and losing it all. The devil is truly a brutal boss. But wait a second, aren't we forgetting something? So, here's the thing. Since these odds are so terrible, we really want to do everything we can to get a good time on other patterns. That is really what separates a good Cuphead speedrunner from a great one. This game has so much RNG that it is simply impossible to get the best possible luck on every single boss. So anyone who is capable of being on the receiving end of bad RNG and still get the best time they can with that, no matter how difficult that is going to ultimately get much better runs than someone who is more reliant on that good RNG to get a good time on a boss. With that being said, this entire time we've been ignoring an entire half of the fight, which is any pattern that ultimately gets the spider instead of the dragon. This attack is fairly unpredictable and leads to a lot of missed damage, because we need to rely on the spider landing on our lubber traps while it's out of the screen, and they might completely miss because he might land somewhere else. But this attack isn't as unpredictable as it looks, and if we want to maximize our chances of closing out a good run, we must try and make as much sense as we can out of it. So, after having put it aside for all this time, we need to finally plunge into the darkness and examine the mess that is the spider. When the spider is unleashed, he will hop in and out of the screen a few times, then return back to the throne. There are 3 random components to the spider: how many times it will bounce on screen, the amount of time it will stay off screen before starting a hop, and the locations in which he'll land. The amount of hops is a simple one to analyze, as this number is simply chosen between 3 and 5, with equal odds of either 3, 4, or 5. Of course, a smaller amount of hops will mean that this attack will last a shorter amount of time than with a higher amount of hops. The hop delay is just a time between 0.3 and 0.7 seconds. This affects how much of a lubber trap we can set up before the spider will land, so this means that some spider attacks will allow for slightly more damage than others. There isn't too much to analyze here either, aside from one complication that we'll cover later on. Finally, the landing locations is by far our most complicated factor to analyze here. To the naked eye, these would seem completely random and impossible to predict. But what's interesting is that if we take a closer look, they actually work similarly to the overall devil patterns, where the spider has a predetermined list of landing locations that are followed in order, and the only random element being the starting point in this list. The only problem is, there's quite a lot of locations in this list. How many? 20. Here they are. These are coordinates that specify an amount of units relative to the player. So for example, a landing location of 100 means 100 units to the right of what Cuphead's location is right before the spider would appear on screen. A landing locations in the negatives, like this minus 300, means that it's gonna appear on the left side instead. Finally, a 0 just means that it's going to appear exactly on top of Cuphead. So when the spider attack starts, it's going to start from a randomly chosen location in this list, then go down in order until it decides to end the attack and go back to the throne. So what does this mean for us? The good news about this is that if we know where in this list we have started from, we can in fact predict where the spider is going to land in the future, and we can prepare lubber traps that will be able to hit it. For example, if we know that a 300 offset is about to happen, we could set up a lubber trap, then dash to the left to let the spider land to our right and precisely where our lubbers have been prepared. The bad news is that to be able to do that, we have no other choice than to watch the first landing location and try to deduce the starting point in the list from there. Some offsets are unique, like this 150, so if we get it, we will immediately know where we are in this list straight away. Other offsets are duplicate, and in some cases we may have to get up to the 3rd hop to be able to disambiguate between 2 possible locations in the list. Within these ambiguous scenarios, in some of these cases, we can prepare the same lubber trap and be able to hit all future possibilities, like in the case of a 200, where we can prepare a trap in place that can hit both this 50 and this 0. But in other cases, we can't cover all possibilities, and we just have to gamble on one or a few, like with these 450s, where we want to prepare a trap to the right and risk a 1 in 4 chance of missing it on a potential minus 250. The very first hop is problematic too, because of course we cannot set up a lubber trap that can hit every single one of these offsets. The best option we have available is to face right and shoot some lubbers from the ground, which will hit every spider spawning between minus 50 and 150. This list is obviously extremely complicated and difficult to memorize. Actually, it's not enough to just memorize this list, but we need to immediately know what's coming next without hesitation, because we want to immediately start setting up a lubber trap for the next hop. So any time spent trying to recall what comes next will lead to a bunch of missed damage. It is extremely challenging, as this list of offsets is really big and different situations require their own different and fairly specific plays. Let's walk through an example of what handling the spider offsets might look like. First, we set up our initial lubber trap and wait for the first hop. Here, we get a 100 offset, and as a result, he lands right on our lubbers. Worthy of note is also that another challenge of handling this attack is the ability to accurately recognize what landing offset you just got. If not paying very careful attention, it's very easy to confuse a 50 offset with a 100 offset, for example. Anyway, after 100 offset, we have two possibilities. Either we're here and the next offset is a minus 50, or we're here and the next offset is a minus 150. The solution is to simply face left and shoot some lubbers upwards from the ground, which will be able to potentially cover for both. We get a minus 150, so now we know exactly where in the list we are, and we know for a fact that the next offset is a 50. We simply prepare the next trap in place and move away as soon as the spider is about to land. Now, we know that the next offset will be a minus 250, but wait, the spider has already hopped 3 times, so he could decide to end the attack and go back to the throne. To cover for both cases, we can set up the trap right in the center of the screen and high up, and dash right. Regardless of what happens next, the spider will land on our lubbers and get hit by them. If we do get another hop, we can do a similar thing for the next 200 offset by creating a trap in the center and moving left to cover for both the possibility of the attack ending after the 4th hop, or the possibility of getting a 5th hop. If we do get this 5th hop, we now know that the spider has performed the maximum amount of hops he can do, and we can just stand in the center and get ready for him to return to the throne. Okay, so now hopefully we understand how the spider behaves and how we can maximize the chances of our lubber traps hitting. Now we need to add one more complexity to this, because remember, we are not just trying to keep up constant damage to the spider, but we also want to use quadruple damage lubber axes on the overlapping floors and get the double freeze. And this is where it gets really complicated. The way we normally do this is by waiting until the spider appears on screen, then move out of the way and hit a lubber axe from the side. This can be hard enough to do, especially on the patterns where the spider lands on top of us, which give us very little time to react. But let's take the best double pattern that can lead to a freeze, which is Flame Spider. This pattern was too short for Dragon to allow us to get the freeze, but since even a 3-hop spider is quite a bit longer than that, we can barely get 4 lubber axes off and the 1.8 cards that we need. And this is precisely the issue. We might get only 3 hops, and we need to use 4 EX moves across the duration of this attack. So to guarantee the freeze without having to rely on a 4th hop, we would need to somehow be able to hit 2 EX moves within the same hop. Normally, since the spider stays low to the ground for a very short amount of time, we don't have time to just fire 2 directly to the floor, so instead the only option we have is to shoot one upwards just before it appears on screen, and then shoot a second one downwards right after, and have the spider land on top of us. This is where the spider having random hop delays becomes very problematic, because if we get a shorter or longer delay than we were anticipating, our lubber axes could either hit the spider directly or completely miss, respectively. Unfortunately, there's no way to cover for all possible delays, so we just have to gamble for a timing and hope it works, which is roughly a 1 in 3 chance. Or actually, we are forced to do this, unless we do these up plus down axes on a 200, minus 200, or minus 250 offset, because if we do, then we can hit the spider from the side and we'll have many more frames available to hit him since we no longer have to hit him before he lands. We can potentially hit him after he lands, and with the right timing, this is guaranteed to work. If we happen to get a sequence of offsets that leads to one of these 3 offsets, then we want to use our 2 lubber axes there, otherwise we have to gamble for the 1 in 3 odds of hitting it with the spider landing on top of us. But is this what we want to do? After all, getting 3 hops is only a 1 in 3 chance. We could instead rely on getting a 4th hop and guarantee that we can hit 4 lubber axes by hitting a single one per hop. This does lead to a slower time, because we don't technically need this 4th hop to dish out all the damage we need to get the freeze, but on the plus side it makes it more likely to get the freeze in the first place. Ultimately, what play we want to go for depends on what kind of time we're going for and what offset we encounter. If we want a fast time, we could hope for the 1 in 3 chance to get 3 hops and rely on the 1 in 3 chance to hit 2 lubber axes, while still getting the freeze if we get more hops. On the other hand, if we want a safer, slower fight, we could rely on the 2 in 3 chance to get at least 4 hops and miss the freeze if we do get 3 hops. It's a bit of a difficult call, and it really just depends on what kind of time we're aiming for. This all doesn't apply to the longer devil patterns leading into Spider, like Bubbles, Clap, Spider, where we only have to hit 2 quadruple damage lubber axes to get the freeze, so we can comfortably get all these EXs up within 3 hops, and that's a lot simpler. Anyway, at the end of all this, what kind of times can we get? Well, let's take a look. All the freeze times you see on screen assume a 3-hop spider, while an extra spider hop loses around 2.5 seconds. If lucky enough and well played, these times are actually very close to the dragon times, so in theory, the potential is not bad at all. However, that's a pretty big if, because as we saw, this attack really is difficult and complicated to play around, and occasionally requires taking a few gambles that are being left out for simplicity. Assume that in reality the odds of getting these times on these patterns are much lower, due to having to take the up plus down 1 in 3 gamble on some patterns to get the freeze in 3 ups, and due to often getting more than 3 ups, which will lose a bit of time. The spider truly is a difficult and chaotic attack, but beyond its erratic surface, there is a little bit of order in the chaos, and if mastered, it can actually allow for some very good times sometimes, and it can feel very rewarding to execute correctly.
Let's go! What?
So, there we go. We have finally analyzed every single aspect about this fight. We have gone over all its phases, we have looked at the devil freeze, and we have even looked at the complexity of the spider. I think the devil symbolizes the entire Cuphead run pretty well. It is a brutal fight, and the RNG can screw over a lot of runs, but that very same RNG also makes for a very dynamic and very interesting fight with a lot of complexity attached, and it makes for a very high skill ceiling, where there's a lot of room for a runner to learn new things about how to handle certain patterns more effectively and maximize their chances to close out a good run. It can be frustrating, but it's also beautiful and it can be very rewarding. So, yeah, thanks for watching, for real this time. Why are there 6 minutes left in the runtime? Yep, I'm serious. There's something else we need to talk about before wrapping this up. I think I'll just let you see it for yourself. This is Spider's Kiss, and what it is killing the devil fully within phase 1. It is an absurd trick that uses a 5-hop spider's usually undesirable length against it. It was originally found in Cuphead's Legacy 1.0 version, where we have access to the insanely powerful weapon swap glitch to basically dish out double damage, as well as to an off-screen hitbox that can be hit on the left, and it was coined the Devil's Kiss, in turn giving a nod to a different insanely difficult trick in Chef Saltbaker's fight, which was originally called Chef's Kiss. Later, thanks to the work of Sublime and Grandios, it was found that this was possible on the spider attack and on version 1.1, thanks to how absurdly long this attack can last. So, how does it work? Well, in theory it is pretty simple. First, we need a series of very long attacks leading up to the spider, and for this we either need Clap Bubbles Clap, Slowest Bubbles Clap, or at most, Clap Flames Clap. Then, we absolutely need a 5-hop spider, which again is the most amount of hops the spider can give us. We need to have the spider land on pretty much all our lubber traps, and on top of that, we need to hit 6 lubber EXs during these 5 hops. To do this, we either need to gamble for an up plus down pair of EXs with the spider landing on top of us, which once again has roughly a 1 in 3 chance of hitting, or we need to hit this up plus down on a 200, -200, or -250 landing offset if it happens to be present within our 5 hops, which only happens in 6 out of 20 offsets in a way that we can predict. If we actually get 5 hops, hit most of our lubbers, hit all 6 of our lubber EXs, and generally keep good damage throughout the entire fight, we can barely deplete the devil's health bar before he can jump into the hole and soft lock us. This is really hard to actually do. Not only do we need to keep up good damage and are allowed very few mistakes, but the pattern we even need to pull this off is incredibly rare. How rare? Well, the odds of getting any of the 3 general patterns that allow for Spider's Kiss are 57 in 385, a little rarer than a 1 in 7. Then we need to get the spider, which is a 1 in 2. This spider needs to hop 5 times, which is another 1 in 3. Finally, we either need to land into one of the 6 starting offsets out of 20 that contain a 200, -200, or -250 in a way that we can predict, or one of the other 4 starting offsets that allows us to hit all our lubber traps as they don't contain any unpredictable faraway offsets within our 5 ops, and then gamble for the 1 in 3 chance to hit the up plus down EXs with the spider falling on top of us. Technically, we can get the trick on other offsets as well, but it's so absurdly difficult and also requires getting very lucky with long hop delays to allow us to hit more lubbers with our traps, so for simplicity we will ignore this and call the offset luck an 11 in 30 chance, roughly a 1 in 3. If we combine all these odds together, we get a whopping 19 in 2100 chance, or around 0.9%. So that's pretty unlikely. But it's time to answer the question I'm sure is on everyone's mind. How much time does it save? As a reminder, these are some of the best times you can get with the Devil Freeze. And here's the times you can get with Spider's Kiss. Well, they're not bad, but they're not exactly groundbreaking. They're comparable to the best freeze times, really, which I think is a good thing, considering how rare the luck required even is. If this trick was required to get on a good run, then this would mean having to go through over 100 runs to the devil on average to finally get just one attempt that could be beat, and that would be an insane experience and probably make this run pretty unfun. But it is pretty funny that this trick is very rare and very difficult, and it doesn't even provide that good of a time. And I really want to reiterate just how difficult this is to actually execute. We have all our normal spider challenges, with having to immediately make the right plays for any given offset and occasionally having very little time to react if getting an unpredictable close offset. But we also need to have very good damage coming into it to have a chance. Clap Bubbles Clap is very long and actually forces us to stop shooting for a bit to bait up the spider, so this pattern is the easiest one to work with. But the other two, Slowest Bubbles Clap and especially Clap Flames Clap, give us much less time, and losing a bit of damage during the course of the fight could be fatal. This is a very deadly combination. It's challenging enough to have to execute a difficult trick, but if the game doesn't even give us the chance to naturally encounter this pattern in the wild very often at all, it becomes very difficult to actually get natural practice at it and get used to having to bring the play required for it on the nerves that a run on pace for a new personal best might bring. We can of course practice it in isolation with mods, which is great, but doing it in a run just hits different. Imagine for a second running this game for several months, seeing all sorts of devil patterns on PB pace, but never quite this one. Then, one day, it finally happens. The pattern is Clap Flames Clap. The next attack is the spider, and he actually starts from a favorable offset. This alone is roughly a 1 in 27 chance, and it's an optimistic estimate because it includes offsets that are very hard to work with and might require the 1 in 3 gamble to hit 2 EXs in one hop later. But nevertheless, gears in your head start turning, and you think that this trick might actually be happening if you'll hop off times, maybe hit the 1 in 3 up plus down gamble if you need to, and you don't make a terrible mistake somewhere. That's when your heart immediately starts racing, and it really does make it infinitely harder to have the lucid mind and accurate fingers that closing out Spider's Kiss requires. As a matter of fact, so far this trick has never been executed successfully at the end of a full game run. I'm confident this will happen eventually, but I think it speaks volumes to how insane of an achievement this would be. I am looking forward to the day that happens. Maybe, just maybe, it could even happen at the end of a world record run. That's wishful thinking, but it would honestly be pretty legendary. Thanks for watching. This time, truly for real. This video was so long. If you'd like to see more videos like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel as well as to my second channel where I post all my speedruns. Take care!